Sarah Brandon had always valued her privacy, which was why she had chosen this house, a modest yet well-secured home at the edge of a quiet suburban neighborhood. She wasn't someone who needed grand social circles or the constant hum of interaction. Her life was simple, structured, and exactly the way she wanted it. Working remotely in cybersecurity allowed her the luxury of setting her own schedule, and she had spent the past few months making the house truly hers. Every detail, from the reinforced locks on the doors to the well-maintained fencing around the property, reflected her meticulous nature. This was her sanctuary, her personal retreat from the unpredictability of the world. It wasn't that she was paranoid, but experience had taught her that trusting too easily often led to disappointment, and she had no intention of letting anyone disrupt the sense of safety she had worked so hard to establish. The only company she truly relied on was her two dogs, Remy, a strong and intelligent Belgian Malinois, and Daisy, a gentle but sharp-eyed Labrador retriever. They were more than just pets, they were her family, her protectors, and the only living beings she fully trusted. She had trained them well, ensuring they responded to commands with precision, especially when it came to guarding the house. Their presence provided an added layer of security, one that made her feel at ease even on the darkest nights. She often sat on her back patio with them after long workdays, enjoying the crisp evening air, the rustling of leaves in the trees, and the distant hum of the neighborhood settling down for the night. The suburb she had moved into had seemed unremarkable at first glance, just another pocket of neatly lined houses with well-kept lawns and friendly enough neighbors who offered polite nods but never pried too much. That was exactly what she had wanted: distance without hostility, familiarity without obligation. But one person had disrupted that balance almost immediately. From the first week in her new home, Sarah had noticed her neighbor, Candace Hall, watching her. It wasn't the casual curiosity of someone welcoming a new resident, nor was it the nosy but ultimately harmless interest of an older woman with too much time on her hands. Candace's gaze lingered too long, her presence felt oddly invasive, even when she wasn't doing anything overtly threatening. There was something about the way she observed Sarah's movements, the way her eyes followed her when she let the dogs out, that unsettled her in a way she couldn't quite define. Their first conversation had been brief, but even in those few minutes, Sarah had sensed an undercurrent of something off. Candace had approached her with a thin-lipped smile, her hands clasped too tightly in front of her, as if restraining some impulse. She had commented on the dogs almost immediately. "They're beautiful," she had said, eyes flicking between Remy and Daisy. "Strong, too. The kind of dogs that need an owner who really knows what they're doing." Sarah had nodded politely, already feeling the instinctive urge to disengage. "They're well-trained." Candace had hummed in response, her gaze lingering on Remy in particular. "My husband always wanted a Belgian Malinois," she had mused, voice soft, almost wistful. "Said they were the best kind of protection. Smart, loyal, obedient." Her smile had widened, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You're lucky to have them." There was something in the way she had said it that made Sarah uneasy. It wasn't the usual compliment a dog lover might give. There was an underlying implication in her tone, a weight to her words that Sarah didn't like. From that moment on, she kept her interactions with Candace to a minimum, offering nothing more than a nod when their paths crossed. But the woman's interest in her dogs didn't wane. If anything, it seemed to intensify. She often stood near the fence that separated their properties, watching as Sarah played with Remy and Daisy in the backyard. At first, Sarah tried to ignore it, assuming Candace was just another lonely neighbor with little else to occupy her time. But then the small things started happening, the subtle but deliberate acts that couldn't be brushed off as coincidences. One afternoon, Sarah had found small bundles of herbs tied together with red string hanging from her fence. They were positioned exactly where Remy and Daisy usually sniffed when they ran along the perimeter. The discovery had made her pause, unease creeping up her spine. She wasn't superstitious, but the placement felt intentional, deliberate in a way that suggested it wasn't just some harmless decoration. She had removed them immediately, tossing them into the trash without a second thought. Then there was the night she caught Candace standing by the fence again, but this time she wasn't just watching. She was whispering something under her breath, her lips barely moving, her eyes fixed on the dogs as they stood tense, ears perked, hackles raised. Sarah had stepped outside, making her presence known, and Candace had turned to her with a slow, unsettling smile. "They like me," she had said softly, as if that explained everything. Sarah had felt her patience thinning. "Don't stand there at night," she had replied, voice firm. "It's unsettling." Candace's smile hadn't faltered. "I'm just admiring them." It was the way she said them, the possessiveness in her tone, that made Sarah's stomach tighten. That was the night she started locking the gate to the backyard. It wasn't that she was afraid, at least not yet, but something was wrong. She knew that instinctively, the way one knows when a storm is about to break, even if the sky is still deceptively clear. She had dealt with her share of unsettling situations before, had learned over the years to trust her gut when something felt off. And this felt very, very off. Then came the night that erased any doubt. It was well past midnight when she woke to the sound of low, rumbling growls, not the casual, half-asleep noises her dogs sometimes made, but a deep, warning growl that sent adrenaline spiking through her veins before she was even fully conscious. She sat up quickly, her heart hammering as she reached for the flashlight she kept on the nightstand. Remy and Daisy were both standing near the sliding glass door that led to the patio, their bodies rigid, their eyes fixed on something outside. The motion-activated floodlight had turned on, casting harsh white light over the backyard. Sarah swung her legs out of bed, moving quickly but quietly toward the door. She didn't open it, not yet. Instead, she flicked on the brighter exterior lights and peered through the glass. Candace was standing on her patio, not near the fence. Not in her own yard. She was inside Sarah's property, her bare feet planted on the wooden deck, her nightgown billowing slightly in the breeze. And in her hand, held loosely but unmistakably, was a leather leash. Sarah's pulse roared in her ears as she took a slow, steadying breath. She wasn't the type to panic. Panic was useless. Panic got people hurt. Instead, she reached for her phone, her fingers moving with practiced efficiency as she dialed. The call connected almost immediately. "There's an intruder on my property," she said, voice calm but firm. "I need officers dispatched immediately." Outside, Candace's lips parted into a slow, eerie smile. And then, in a voice barely louder than a whisper, she said, "They're not yours." Sarah's grip on the phone tightened as she stared at Candace, who remained eerily still on her patio, the leather leash dangling from her fingers. The sheer audacity of it, the absolute violation of her space, sent a cold wave of fury through her, but she forced herself to remain composed. The last thing she needed was to escalate the situation before the police arrived. Remy and Daisy were both still on high alert, their hackles raised, their growls a low, vibrating hum against the tense silence of the night. Sarah took a slow breath and kept her voice level as she relayed her address to the dispatcher, ensuring every word was clear. Candace didn't move, didn't react, as if she weren't even aware that Sarah was making the call. She just stood there, fingers absently caressing the leash, as though lost in thought. "The officers are on their way," the dispatcher informed her, but Sarah barely heard the words. Her focus was entirely on the woman outside, on the strange, dreamlike quality of her presence. It was the middle of the night, yet Candace wasn't wearing shoes, wasn't carrying anything else, just that leash, as if she had walked straight from her home with a singular purpose in mind. Sarah kept her eyes on her, refusing to look away, refusing to give Candace even a second to move out of her sight. And then, without any warning, Candace finally lifted her gaze to meet Sarah's through the glass. Her lips curled into that same slow, almost knowing smile, her head tilting slightly to the side in a way that sent an involuntary shudder through Sarah's spine. And then, softly, she whispered something. Sarah couldn't hear the words through the glass, but she could see the way Candace's lips moved. "They're not yours." Sarah's stomach turned to ice. She had heard those words before, the night Candace had stood by the fence watching her dogs. She had brushed it off as an odd, intrusive comment then, but now it felt like something more. A warning. A claim. A threat. The floodlights cast harsh shadows across the patio, highlighting the deep lines in Candace's face, the unnatural stillness of her body. The dogs were pressed against the door, Remy's growl growing sharper, Daisy's body tense, as if she were waiting for a command. The instinct to act, to do something, burned through Sarah, but she stayed rooted in place, waiting. She wasn't going to open the door. She wasn't going to step outside. Candace wanted a reaction. She wasn't going to give her one. The seconds stretched into minutes. The silence between them was suffocating, broken only by the occasional rustle of the trees as the wind picked up. Sarah could feel the tension coiling in her muscles, every nerve in her body screaming that this wasn't just some harmless intrusion, that this wasn't just an old woman with boundary issues. This was something else entirely. And then Candace moved. It was slow at first, just a slight shift of her weight, the smallest indication that she was finally acknowledging Sarah's presence beyond that unsettling smile. Then, in one fluid motion, she lifted the leash and dropped it onto the patio floor. The soft slap of leather against wood made Sarah's pulse spike, but she kept her face impassive. Candace took a step back. Then another, and another. Her eyes never left Sarah's, her expression never changing. She reached the edge of the patio, toes curling slightly as she stepped onto the cold grass, and then, with the same slow, deliberate movements, she turned and walked away. Sarah exhaled sharply, her breath coming out in a controlled but shaky release. She didn't move, didn't so much as blink until Candace disappeared into the darkness, swallowed by the thick shadows between their properties. The police arrived 7 minutes later. By then, Candace was long gone, and all that remained was the leash lying on Sarah's patio like some kind of offering, some kind of silent message. She met the officers at the front door, explaining the situation in a calm, methodical manner, making sure to emphasize the fact that this wasn't just a case of a confused old woman wandering onto the wrong property. This was the second time Candace had made a clear, purposeful intrusion. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't harmless. It was escalating. The officers were professional but unsurprised. They had likely dealt with their share of neighborhood disputes, cases of trespassing that often boiled down to minor grievances and territorial squabbles. But Sarah wasn't interested in filing a simple complaint. She wanted documentation. She wanted them to understand that this wasn't just a one-off incident. She showed them the security footage from her cameras, letting them watch as Candace stood motionless in the harsh glare of the floodlights as she dropped the leash with that strange, unreadable expression. The officers exchanged glances, and for the first time, Sarah saw something that looked like genuine concern. "She didn't say anything to you?" one of them asked, as he scribbled notes onto his pad. Not that I could hear, Sarah answered honestly. But she was whispering something, and before she left, she dropped that. She gestured toward the leash, still lying on the patio, untouched. The officer frowned, glancing back at the footage. Has she ever done anything like this before? Sarah hesitated for half a second before deciding to tell them everything. The staring, the whispered words, the strange bundles of herbs tied to her fence, the way she always seemed to be watching, always lingering just close enough to be noticed but never close enough to confront. As she spoke, she could see the way the officers' expressions shifted, the way their initial neutrality gave way to something more serious. "We can talk to her," one of them finally said. "Make it clear that this kind of behavior isn't acceptable." Sarah nodded, knowing it was probably the best she could hope for at this stage. Candace hadn't committed any major crime yet, but there was an edge to her actions, a deliberate nature that Sarah couldn't ignore. And if she was right, if this wasn't just some harmless eccentricity but something darker, something more dangerous, then Candace wouldn't stop just because the police had a conversation with her. She would have to be ready. When the officers left, Sarah locked every door and window in the house, double-checking the security system, reinforcing the locks on the gates. It wasn't fear that drove her. It was preparation. She had no intention of being caught off guard. The leash remained on the patio for several more hours. She didn't touch it, didn't move it. It sat there like a silent accusation, a quiet promise that whatever this was, it wasn't over. When she finally picked it up, the leather was still warm. And in the dim light of her kitchen, she noticed something she hadn't before, something that made her stomach drop. Etched into the worn surface of the leash, barely visible but unmistakable, was a name. Remy. Sarah stared at the name etched into the worn leather of the leash, her fingers tightening around it as a deep, unsettling feeling spread through her chest. The engraving wasn't fresh, nor was it something that could have been done recently. It had been there for years, worn down by time and use, the letters slightly faded but still unmistakable. Remy. Her dog's name. But that didn't make sense. This leash had never belonged to her. She had never seen it before tonight. And yet, here it was, left on her patio like some kind of twisted message, like a reminder of something she didn't remember forgetting. She exhaled slowly, setting the leash down on the kitchen counter, refusing to let paranoia creep in. There were explanations, logical, rational explanations. Maybe Candace had once owned a dog named Remy. Maybe this leash had belonged to him. Maybe she had seen Sarah's Remy, and in some unhinged way, felt like he belonged to her instead. That would explain why she had been watching them so closely, why she had whispered those unnerving words, why she had stood on her patio with that eerie, unwavering stare. But then another thought crawled into her mind, one she hadn't considered before. What if this leash hadn't been left as a message? What if it had been placed there as a claim? The idea made her stomach churn. She had dealt with obsessive behavior before, former colleagues who took things too far, strangers online who thought knowing small details about her life made them entitled to more, but this was different. This wasn't someone trying to insert themselves into her life from a distance. This was physical, tangible, a deliberate intrusion into her personal space. Candace had walked onto her property, stood in the place where she sat every evening with her dogs, and left behind something intimate, something familiar, as if to say, I was here, and I will be back. She pushed away from the counter and moved through the house, checking the locks again, even though she already knew they were secure. She reinforced the sliding doors, shutting every curtain, making sure there were no gaps, no open lines of sight. She wasn't the type to panic, wasn't the type to let fear dictate her actions, but she also wasn't naive. If Candace was willing to walk onto her patio in the middle of the night, barefoot, carrying an old leash, then what else was she willing to do? She didn't sleep that night. Not because she was afraid Candace would come back immediately, but because she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The police had spoken to her neighbor. They had made it clear that her behavior was unacceptable, and yet Sarah didn't believe for a second that it would stop her. If anything, she suspected it would do the opposite. Candace wasn't someone who operated on normal social boundaries. She had seen it in the way the woman spoke, in the way she lingered too long, in the way she never outright threatened but always implied. The next morning, Sarah found a new bundle of herbs tied to her fence. She didn't touch it immediately. She crouched next to it, studying the careful knots, the deliberate way it had been arranged. It wasn't the same as the ones she had found before. This one was larger, more intricate, and woven into the center was something small and white. She leaned in closer, eyes narrowing. A bone. Her skin prickled. It was clean, stripped of any flesh, bleached by time or treatment. It could have been from anything, a bird, a small animal, but the fact that it was there, placed so deliberately among the dried herbs, made her stomach twist. She took a photo, then pulled on a pair of gloves before carefully cutting the bundle down. She wasn't about to leave it there. If Candace thought this was some kind of game, then Sarah would make it clear that she wasn't playing. By noon she had called animal control, not because she thought they could do much, but because she wanted it on record. They took the bundle, though they seemed more confused than concerned, and told her they'd let her know if the bone came from a domestic pet. That was enough for now. That evening, when she let the dogs out into the yard, they both hesitated. Daisy sniffed at the ground near the fence, her body tense, her ears flicking back. Remy stayed close to Sarah's side, his posture rigid. They knew. They felt it, too. The unease didn't fade as the days passed. If anything, it grew, creeping into every quiet moment, settling into the spaces where Sarah should have felt safe. She checked the cameras religiously, scanned through footage every morning, waiting for some sign that Candace had returned, but the only thing she ever saw was the shifting of shadows, the movement of trees in the wind. It was almost worse than seeing something tangible. It made her feel like she was waiting for an attack she couldn't predict. And then, one night, she heard the click. It was soft, barely audible over the hum of her laptop, but distinct enough to send a sharp jolt of awareness through her. The sound of a gate latch shifting. She didn't hesitate. She rose from her chair, moving swiftly but silently toward the back of the house, her pulse a steady drum in her ears. The dogs were already there, standing near the sliding door, their bodies rigid. Their eyes were locked onto something outside. She flicked off the lights before approaching the glass, keeping herself hidden in the darkness of the room. The backyard was dimly illuminated by the ambient glow of the security lights, casting long, sharp shadows across the lawn. At first she didn't see anything. The gate was still closed. The yard was still. But the dogs hadn't moved, hadn't relaxed, and she trusted them more than she trusted her own eyes. Then, out of the corner of her vision, she saw the shape. Candace. She was standing at the edge of the fence, barely visible beyond the reach of the security lights. She wasn't moving. She wasn't speaking. She was just standing there watching. A slow, seeping rage spread through Sarah's chest. She had had enough. She reached for her phone and started dialing before she even stepped away from the window, but as soon as she moved, Candace did too. Not away. Closer. Sarah's stomach clenched. Candace stepped toward the gate, one slow footstep at a time, her body moving with an eerie, deliberate slowness, as if she knew exactly how unnerving it was. Her hands remained at her sides, relaxed, empty, as though she were merely taking a late-night stroll rather than stalking the edge of someone else's property. Sarah's voice was ice when she spoke into the phone. "My neighbor is trespassing again." Candace stopped. It was so immediate, so precise, that Sarah knew she had heard her. And then, in a voice that carried too easily through the night air, Candace said, "I just wanted to see them." Sarah's jaw tightened. "You need to leave." Candace tilted her head, that same slow, knowing smile curving her lips. "They miss me," she whispered. Sarah's fingers curled into a fist at her side. She had planned to wait for the police, to let them handle it, but something inside her snapped. She strode forward, yanking the back door open just enough to be heard, keeping herself partially behind it. "This is your final warning. If I see you here again, I won't just call the police. I will make sure there are legal consequences. I will make sure you are removed from this neighborhood. You are not welcome here. You are not welcome here, my home. And you sure as hell are not welcome near my dogs." Candace's expression didn't change, but she took a step back, and then another, and as she moved into the darkness, her voice drifted through the cool night air, soft and certain. "They were never yours to begin with." Sarah had always prided herself on being a logical person, someone who made decisions based on facts rather than emotion, someone who could assess risks and act accordingly without letting paranoia take over. But no matter how many times she went over the events of the past few weeks, no matter how much she tried to approach the situation with the same measured reasoning she used in her work, she couldn't shake the cold weight of dread settling in her chest. Something was deeply, profoundly wrong. Candace wasn't just a nosy neighbor with an unhealthy interest in her dogs. She wasn't just an overstepping suburban woman with too much time on her hands. She was something else entirely, something that made the hairs on the back of Sarah's neck stand on end every time she thought about the way the woman had spoken to her. The way she had moved, the way she had stood on her patio, inside her property, as if she had every right to be there. It wasn't just the trespassing, though that alone would have been enough to warrant concern. It was the deliberate nature of it all, the way Candace seemed to be following a pattern, slowly breaking down the barriers between them, not just physically but psychologically. First it had been the staring, the watching from behind her fence, the unsettling way she always seemed to be present whenever Sarah let the dogs out. Then came the intrusive questions, the too personal comments about Remy, the way she had spoken about him as if he were something more than just a dog to her. After that, the messages had become clearer, more targeted, the bundles of herbs tied to the fence, the strange symbols, the whispers in the dark, and now the leash. An old, worn leash with her dog's name engraved on it, something that could not be a coincidence, something that sent a shiver of recognition down Sarah's spine the moment she had seen it. She hadn't wanted to overreact, hadn't wanted to believe that there was something truly malicious happening. But now, as she stared at the worn leather lying on her kitchen counter, she knew this was no longer a matter of whether Candace's behavior was concerning. It was a matter of how far she was willing to go. Sarah needed answers. She started with public records, sifting through property listings, old news articles, anything she could find that might shed some light on Candace's past. It was slow work, but the deeper she dug, the more unsettled she became. Candace had been married. Her husband, Richard Hall, had died 5 years ago. The obituary was short, factual, nothing particularly noteworthy about it. But what caught Sarah's attention wasn't the obituary itself, it was the messages left behind by people who had known him. They weren't the kind of condolences you would expect. There was something off about them, something that felt almost like relief. I hope he's at peace now. Some people don't know how to let go. She never let him rest. Sarah reread the words over and over, a strange chill settling over her as she began to piece together an unsettling picture. There was something in those messages, something unsaid but undeniable. Whoever these people were, they had known Candace, and they had known her well enough to understand something that Sarah was only now beginning to grasp. Candace didn't let things go. She held on, obsessively, desperately, beyond reason. And once she decided something belonged to her, she didn't stop until she had full control over it. The implications were disturbing, but they didn't give her the hard proof she needed. She kept digging. She combed through every database she could access, looking for anything complaints, legal disputes, restraining orders, until finally, she found something that made her blood run cold. A missing dog report, filed 20 years ago. The name of the dog was Remy. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the document. Belgian Malinois. Male. Reported missing by Candace Hall. The official notes on the report were sparse, nothing more than the usual bureaucratic formalities. Owner claims the animal was stolen. No known suspects. No further action taken. Her fingers trembled slightly as she reached for her phone and dialed the number for the rescue center where she had adopted Remy. It took a few calls to find someone who had been working there at the time, but eventually a woman with a calm, patient voice answered. "Yes, I remember him," she said after Sarah gave her the details. "He was part of a welfare case." Sarah frowned. Welfare case, the woman hesitated. His owner didn't surrender him willingly. A cold weight settled in Sarah's stomach. The conditions weren't good, the woman continued carefully. There were reports from neighbors, concerns about isolation, obsessive behavior, refusal to allow anyone near the animals. We did a wellness check and found enough cause to remove them. It wasn't an easy process. She fought it every step of the way. Sarah swallowed hard. Did she ever try to get him back? A sigh on the other end of the line. Yes, repeatedly. She contacted the shelter, the adoption agencies, even tried to track down the families who took the dogs. We had to file a legal order to stop the harassment. A pause. Is she bothering you? Sarah didn't answer immediately. Her grip on the phone was tight, her pulse a steady, heavy thrum in her ears. She found him, she finally said, voice quiet. The woman on the other end went silent for a moment. Then, just as quietly, she said, "Be careful." Sarah hung up and stared at the phone in her hand, her mind racing through every interaction, every moment of unease, every creeping suspicion that she had dismissed as overthinking. Candace hadn't just been watching her. She hadn't just been obsessing. She had been waiting, and now she had decided it was time to take him back. Sarah felt something cold and sharp settle in her chest, not fear, not exactly. Resolve. She reinforced the security cameras, ensuring there were no blind spots, no gaps in coverage. She replaced the locks on the gates, added motion sensors along the perimeter, set up automatic alerts that would notify her the second anyone stepped too close to her property. If Candace thought she could sneak onto her land again without consequence, she was in for a rude awakening. She wasn't just going to sit and wait for Candace to escalate. She was going to be ready. The house was silent that night, but the silence no longer felt like safety. It felt like a trap waiting to be sprung, like the tension before a storm. Sarah sat in the darkness of her living room, her hand resting on Remy's back, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing beneath her palm. Daisy was curled up at her feet, her warmth a grounding presence. They trusted her, they depended on her, and she would not let Candace take them. The night stretched on, heavy and endless. Then, somewhere beyond the fence, there was the sound of movement, a shift in the darkness, a presence. Sarah didn't move, didn't breathe, just sat perfectly still as the security system sent an alert to her phone. Motion detected. She picked up the device and opened the live feed, and there, standing inside the yard, was Candace, holding a leash. Sarah didn't react immediately. She had trained herself not to. Instead, she remained perfectly still, eyes locked onto the screen of her phone as she watched the live feed from the security cameras. Candace was standing inside the yard, her posture eerily relaxed, her hands hanging loosely by her sides. The leash she held was the same one she had left behind before, its worn leather swaying slightly as she shifted her weight. There was no urgency in her movements, no sign of fear or hesitation, just that same unsettling calm that made Sarah's skin crawl. She forced herself to breathe evenly, fingers tightening around the edges of her phone as she assessed the situation with practiced detachment. This was no longer about passive threats or psychological games. Candace had made her move. She had crossed the final boundary. Sarah had reinforced every lock, secured every entry point, and yet here she was inside. She didn't bother calling the police. There was no time to wait for them. No point in hoping they would arrive before Candace decided to do whatever it was she had come here to do. Instead, Sarah moved with quiet efficiency, keeping her eyes on the screen as she reached for the small firearm she kept secured in a lockbox by the bedside. She wasn't reckless, had never been the type to rely on intimidation or force, but she also understood reality. Candace wasn't afraid of cameras, of police reports, of legal warnings. She wasn't going to stop until something made her stop. Stepping carefully to avoid making noise, Sarah moved toward the back of the house, her breath controlled, her pulse steady. The dogs were already alert, standing close to her but not barking, their training kicking in as they sensed the shift in her energy. She didn't want them near the door, didn't want them to be the reason Candace finally acted on whatever was going on inside her mind. Through the reinforced glass, Sarah could see Candace more clearly now. The faint glow from the security lights cast harsh shadows across her face, making the deep lines around her mouth and eyes look even more pronounced. But what unnerved Sarah the most wasn't her presence, it was her expression. There was no rage, no frustration, no sense of urgency, just certainty. Sarah unbolted the lock, but she didn't open the door. She didn't step outside. Instead, she spoke, her voice low and firm. "You are trespassing." Candace didn't move. "You need to leave." A slow tilt of the head, almost thoughtful. Then, finally, she spoke. "I'm not trespassing." Sarah's grip on the doorframe tightened. "You're inside my yard." "You think it's yours," Candace said, her voice soft like she was explaining something simple to a child, but it never was. Not really. The air felt heavier, thicker, as if the very space between them was pressing in. "Leave." Candace took a slow breath, her fingers shifting slightly on the leash, her nails tapping against the worn leather. "I came to take him home." Sarah didn't blink. "You're not taking anything." For the first time, Candace's expression changed, something flickering behind her eyes, something dark, something sharp. "You don't understand," she murmured. "You don't know what it was like. He wasn't supposed to be taken. He was mine. He still is." Sarah stayed silent, waiting. Candace's lips parted slightly, a shaky exhale escaping as she took a small step forward, her bare foot pressing into the grass with deliberate slowness. "He remembers me. I know he does. He wouldn't have forgotten. You've kept him away from me, but he knows." Her eyes flicked past Sarah, toward the darkened space where Remy stood just out of sight, his body tense, his ears pinned back. "You're keeping him from me." Sarah felt something coil tight in her chest. There was no reasoning with this. Candace wasn't speaking from reality anymore, she was speaking from belief. And belief was more dangerous than anger, more dangerous than desperation. Belief was unwavering. "You need to leave," Sarah said again, her voice like steel. A slow blink. Then Candace smiled, just slightly, just enough for the edges of her lips to curl in that eerie, knowing way. "You don't deserve him," she said, so quietly that Sarah barely heard it through the thick glass. "You never did." And then, without another word, she turned and walked back toward the gate, her steps measured, unhurried. Sarah didn't move until the latch clicked shut behind her, until the darkness swallowed her retreating form. Only then did she lock the door again, her fingers pressing into the cool metal handle as she forced herself to breathe, forced herself to remain calm. This wasn't over. She spent the next few hours securing everything, reinforcing the locks, adjusting the security system to trigger alerts for even the slightest movement near the perimeter, reviewing every camera angle, every blind spot, every possible vulnerability. She would not let Candace get this close again. But even as she worked, even as she ensured every precaution was in place, she knew deep in her gut, with the same certainty that had kept her safe in situations far less predictable than this, that Candace had already decided how this would end. And it wouldn't be with her simply walking away. The next day, the official complaint was filed. Legal action was initiated. Sarah's lawyer pushed for a restraining order, though they both knew it would take time. Time that Sarah wasn't sure she had. Candace wasn't seen for 2 days. Then, on the third morning, Sarah stepped outside to find something new waiting for her. A package. It was small, wrapped in brown paper, placed neatly in front of her door. No name, no return address. Just sitting there, waiting. Sarah didn't touch it immediately. She crouched next to it, scanning it for any signs of tampering, of a threat she couldn't see. But there were no wires, no strange markings. Just the quiet, unsettling presence of something that did not belong. She brought it inside carefully, using gloves, setting it down on the kitchen counter as the dogs watched her with wary eyes. She unwrapped it slowly, her breath steady, her hands firm. Inside, there was a collar. Remy's collar. The one he was still wearing. Sarah's vision tunneled for a moment, a slow, creeping chill running down her spine as she turned her head, her pulse hammering against her ribs. Remy was standing in the doorway, his dark eyes watching her. His collar was still on him. She turned back to the one in the box, lifting it slightly, feeling the worn leather beneath her fingers. It was identical. An exact copy. A replica, down to the smallest detail. Sarah set it down, inhaling slowly, forcing her thoughts into order. This was psychological warfare. Candace wanted her to feel exposed, uncertain, rattled. She wanted her to question everything, to wonder if she was being watched, if her home had already been breached. But Sarah had spent her life understanding threats, and she knew one thing with absolute certainty. The moment someone tried to make you feel unsafe in your own home, they had already decided how far they were willing to go, and Candace had just told her exactly what she planned to do next. Sarah stood in the center of her kitchen, staring at the identical collar lying on the counter, feeling the weight of the situation settle deep in her chest, like a stone dropped into dark water. The cold logic of the situation told her that Candace had been in her home, that she had somehow gained access to something so specific, so personal, that it shattered any illusion of safety Sarah had tried to maintain. Every possible scenario ran through her mind in rapid succession, every outcome leading to the same conclusion: Candace was not going to stop. Not now, not ever. She had made her move, made it clear that she was operating on her own reality, one where Sarah was not the rightful owner of her own dog, one where Remy had never stopped belonging to her. Her breath was slow and measured as she turned away from the counter, her mind already adjusting, already shifting gears. The time for waiting had passed. The time for being cautious, for hoping the system would do its job, for assuming this was just an escalation that could be handled with paperwork and security cameras. It was over. Candace wasn't following the rules of society. She was playing by an entirely different set of rules, one where Sarah wasn't a person but an obstacle, something standing between her and what she believed was hers. And Sarah knew, with a certainty as sharp as the edge of a blade, that people like that didn't back down just because they were told to. They didn't stop just because the law told them to. They stopped when they were made to. She didn't sleep that night. She stayed awake, sitting in the darkness with Remy at her feet and Daisy curled against her side, every light in the house off, every door locked, every camera feed open on her laptop. The air was thick with tension, every creak of the house, every rustling of the wind outside pressing against her nerves like the drawn string of a bow waiting to snap. And then, sometime deep into the night, it happened. The motion sensor lights flared to life in the backyard. Sarah didn't react outwardly. She had been expecting this, had been waiting for it. Slowly, she reached for her phone, her fingers moving silently as she pulled up the security feed. The camera closest to the back fence flickered to life, the image grainy in the low light, but still clear enough to make out the shape moving through the yard. Candace. She was inside the property again, but this time she wasn't just standing at the fence, wasn't just watching, wasn't whispering cryptic words into the night like some haunting presence that lingered just out of reach. She was moving with purpose, walking toward the house with slow, deliberate steps, her posture eerily relaxed, as if she were simply returning home after a long absence. Sarah stayed completely still, her heartbeat steady, her breathing even. She didn't reach for the phone to call the police. She had already made that mistake too many times before, had already learned that waiting for them to arrive would do nothing. Instead, she moved carefully, silently, keeping her presence in the house unknown, watching as Candace approached the patio door. The woman stopped in front of it, just standing there for a moment, her face partially obscured by the reflection of the security lights. Then, without hesitation, she tried the handle. The lock held, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that she had tried, that she had moved past any pretense, that she had acted on her delusion. Sarah's grip on her phone tightened as Candace leaned forward, pressing her forehead against the glass, her breath fogging up the surface as her fingers rested against the door in an almost reverent gesture. Then she spoke. "I know you can hear me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the night. "I know you're in there keeping him from me." Sarah didn't answer. "He's confused," Candace continued, her fingers trailing down the glass in a slow, deliberate motion. "You've poisoned him against me, but it's not your fault. You don't understand. You don't know what he means to me." Sarah remained still, watching. "You can end this," Candace murmured. "You don't have to fight me. Just let him go. Just open the door and let him come home." Silence stretched between them. Then Candace stepped back, standing tall again, her head tilting slightly to the side, studying the reflection of the house in the glass, as if she were trying to see inside, trying to find them. Her voice softened. "I forgive you." Something inside Sarah snapped. She had spent weeks holding back, spent weeks waiting, spent weeks hoping that logic and reason and the law would put an end to this. But there was no logic here, no reason, no law that would stop someone who had already decided how this would end. Sarah moved before she could think better of it. She reached for the bat she had placed near the door earlier in the evening, stepped forward, and with one sharp motion, she slammed it against the glass, not to break it, not to open the door, but to make it clear that she was not afraid, that she was not hiding, that she was done playing this game. The impact sent a sharp, cracking sound through the air, loud enough to cut through the night like a gunshot. Candace flinched, her entire body jerking backward, her wide eyes flashing with something that almost looked like shock. Sarah stared at her through the fractured surface, her voice low and unwavering. "If you ever set foot on my property again," she said, "I will make sure you don't walk away from it." Candace didn't move, didn't blink. For the first time, she looked truly unsure, like the reality of the moment was seeping into the edges of her carefully crafted delusion. She took a slow step back, then another, and then, without another word, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows beyond the fence. Sarah stayed where she was until she was completely gone. Then, finally, she let out a breath and dialed the police. This time, when they arrived, they found something more than just another complaint, more than just another warning. They found clear intent. They found evidence of forced entry. They found the recorded audio of Candace admitting to everything. And this time, they didn't just take a statement. They took her. The house was quiet again. For the first time in weeks, the air inside didn't feel suffocating, heavy with the weight of expectation, the constant readiness for something to happen. The police had taken Candace away, and though Sarah knew better than to think that meant the situation was over, there was a finality to the way it had unfolded. There had been no more warnings, no empty reassurances that nothing could be done. The officers had seen the footage, had listened to the recorded audio of Candace whispering through the glass, admitting that she had come to take Remy. They had found the evidence of forced entry, the tampered gate latch, the fingerprints on the patio door. They had no choice but to act. Candace had been taken into custody, charged with trespassing, attempted burglary, and stalking. Sarah had watched as they led her away, her expression eerily blank, her eyes never lifting to meet Sarah's. Even as they placed her into the back of the squad car, Candace had remained silent, her hands resting lightly in her lap, her fingers curled around nothing, as though she were still holding the leash she had brought with her that night, the leash that had never belonged to her. The restraining order had been expedited, and Candace had been prohibited from coming within a mile of Sarah's home, of her dogs, of anything related to her life. But Sarah knew that paper alone wouldn't be enough to fix what had already been broken. Safety wasn't something that could be restored overnight. It wasn't something that could be guaranteed by signatures on a legal document. She knew that better than anyone. In the days that followed, she forced herself to go through the motions of normalcy. She reinforced every lock, installed a second set of security barriers, upgraded the motion sensors to detect even the slightest movement near the property. She restructured her daily routine, varying the time she left the house, making sure she was never predictable, never an easy target. But beneath all of it, beneath the layers of preparation and logic, she felt something else settling in, something deeper, something more insidious. She had always believed that home was a place where you were supposed to feel safe, where the outside world couldn't reach you unless you let it. But Candace had proven her wrong. She had shown her that safety wasn't a matter of locked doors and high fences. It was an illusion, something that could be shattered the moment someone decided it didn't exist. The first few nights after Candace was taken away, Sarah barely slept. Every sound felt like a threat, every shadow a reminder that this wasn't really over. Candace was gone, but the damage had already been done. Sarah expected something else to happen. A message, a sign, some final act of defiance. But none came. Instead, there was only silence. She should have been relieved. She wasn't. The anxiety didn't disappear, but it changed. It became something quieter, something that didn't demand immediate action but still lingered beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to remind her that it was still there. It was in the way she hesitated before opening the front door, in the way she double-checked the locks even when she knew they were secure. It was in the way she found herself waking up in the middle of the night, listening for something that wasn't there. Remy and Daisy sensed it too. They stayed close, their movements more alert, more measured. They had always been well-trained, always attentive, but now they moved with a different kind of awareness, as if they too understood that the rules of the world had shifted. Then, after a week, the first letter arrived. There was no return address, no indication of who had sent it. Just a plain envelope slipped into her mailbox, sealed neatly, waiting for her like something entirely ordinary. But Sarah knew the moment she saw it that it wasn't. She took it inside, setting it on the counter, staring at it for a long time before finally opening it. The paper inside was folded carefully, precisely, as if whoever had written it had taken great care in making sure it looked as unthreatening as possible. It was only one sentence. "I will wait as long as I have to." Sarah exhaled slowly, pressing her fingers against the cool surface of the counter to steady herself. There was no signature, no name, no explicit threat. But she didn't need one. She already knew who had sent it. The police couldn't do anything. Without proof that it had come from Candace, without direct evidence tying it to her, it was just a vague message, just words on paper. It didn't break any laws. It didn't violate the restraining order. But Sarah understood what it meant. She burned the letter in the sink, watching as the flames curled around the edges, turning the words to ash. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat in the darkness of her living room, the security feeds glowing softly in front of her, her hand resting on Remy's back as he lay beside her, his body warm and solid against her. And she waited. But nothing came. The days passed, stretching into weeks, and the unease never fully left her, but it became manageable. The legal proceedings moved forward, slow but steady, and with every new restriction placed on Candace, with every bureaucratic step taken, Sarah felt the weight lessen just slightly. Candace wasn't coming back. Not yet. But Sarah knew, in the way that only someone who had been truly hunted understood, that this wasn't the kind of obsession that simply ended. It was the kind that paused, the kind that waited. The kind that lingered in the spaces between normalcy, just waiting for the right moment to breathe again. So Sarah prepared. She strengthened her defenses, not just physically but mentally. She refused to let herself fall back into the illusion of security, refused to let her guard down just because time had passed. She moved forward, but she never forgot. One evening, months later, she sat on the patio with Remy and Daisy, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in deep hues of orange and red. The air was crisp, the silence peaceful in a way it hadn't been for a long time. She let herself breathe it in, let herself feel something close to normal. And then, without thinking, she reached out and ran her fingers through Remy's fur, her grip tightening just slightly, grounding herself in the reality of the moment. He was here. He was safe. And if Candace ever came back for him, if she ever tried to cross that line again, Sarah would be waiting.